Welcome to my humble abode filled with sunlight. Imagine that. Post-Thanksgiving, but the feasting is not done. In fact, I would argue that we are now in feasting prime season. So this video will be a two-parter. So this video is discussing the history and religious importance of feasting and sacrifice. And then in December, I will subject my roommate, my family members, and my poor oven to trying and testing these real recipes that would be at a feast or perhaps sacrificed. Do I have any quick updates for anybody? Man, my aloe, she's really stringy. How'd that happen, girl? It's so good to see you all again. I keep every video I say I'm trying to get into a regular schedule, but like moving takes like such a toll on you throughout the entire year. Like not just the month and the day that you're actually moving, but all the months leading up to it and then some of the months after it. So I think I just kind of didn't listen to my own needs there. So hopefully going forward, I'm going to stick to once a month for now as I get back on a schedule. So, feasting. Feast of Fools, you think of with the Middle Ages festival. The root word is feast. For the vast majority of pre-industrial society, everything revolved around food and, by extension, feasting. We are, after all, just fleshy monkeys with big brain. And just like all other creatures on Earth, we are subject to the limits of Mother Nature, even if we pretend that we are not. But for the vast majority of human history, they could not even pretend to not be bound by these rules. Many reasons why so many rituals center around goddesses like Demeter or Tyche and anything to do with food and weather. It's just all important. And especially in the colder season, or in certain cases, the drier season, which is less conducive to growing plants, feasting is not just about survival, but of celebration. We see feasts in ancient Greece, especially in the Iliad and the Odyssey, used as a form of politics even, especially in the Iliad. Almost every battle is preceded and then followed by a feast. And this solidifies bonds between the men themselves and also reestablishes social order. So who is sponsoring the feast? Who is providing the food? Who gets to eat first? Who eats what sort of portions? And this devolves in some drama in the Iliad and the Odyssey about certain people not sponsoring a meal properly, or like, hey, I sponsored this meal. Last time you were supposed to sponsor this meal. Now the balance is uneven. Obviously, that's super simplified. They said it much more poetic and manly than I did. This also would literally fuel people for a battle. And oftentimes, the establishment of not sedentary is not the word, but the breakaway from hunter-gatherer follows around animal husbandry and agriculture. That's all around food. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, another important part of these feasts in the ancient Greek tradition is sacrifice. So offering part of your meal to a god. Gods were always present in the ancient Greek society, not necessarily omnipresent in the sense of every god is everywhere all at once, but more of the gods in general were everywhere, everything all at once. This was especially true of a feast. You see, according to many ancient writers, feasts and dining were something that the gods gave to us. And according to Hesiod, was something that the golden age of man used to do with the gods themselves. I talk a little bit about food offerings in my All About Offerings video up here, but that video is absolutely not necessary to view this one, although it is absolutely necessary for my channel views and my channel likes. So if you want a primer on offerings in general, the purpose of offerings, that video covers some. However, I actually read a lot of old information regarding food offerings, so that's going to be my focus here. There has been some spicy scholarly debate on what food offerings actually did for the gods and why we did them. Like, the obvious answer is like, well, we give them offerings to show our devotion, but like, why though? What purpose does it serve? No one can really quite agree on this. The original thought that has persisted for quite some time is that the inedible parts of the meal, usually bones wrapped in fat, which would then create a lot of smoke, that this smoke then actually nourished the gods. However, this is a point that is debated even amongst ancient writers themselves. So Aristophanes in Plutus, in the birds, he makes this joke about Hermes starving because someone makes a smoke offering, but it is obstructed by like a roof or something, so he is unable to eat the meal. However, Hesiod seems to argue that rather the burning of the inedible parts to the gods rather harkens back to that golden age where man and God ate side by side. No piece of writing is as contentious on this as the Homeric hymn to Hermes. Everyone and their mother has an opinion on the Homeric hymn to Hermes. I'm pretty sure if I asked my mom, she would also have an opinion on what this means. So in this, Hermes slaughters 2 cows. He divvies them up into various portions, and then he enjoys the smell of the feast, and he is tempted to eat his portion whole as his rightful portion. However, he doesn't cave to this temptation, making a distinction again between man and God. Man must eat this food, whereas God can smell it but not be tempted to eat it, at least in one theory. Some people actually argue that it has nothing to do with proper sacrifice, but it's rather a founding myth of a certain Greek town which was known for its animal husbandry. Whereas other people argue that it is saying that Hermes and other gods only need the smoke, whereas humans need to eat the flesh. This idea of a burnt offering as the primary offering has persisted in scholarship for quite some time. You burn the parts that you can't eat, and then you eat the parts that you can't eat. That was a really silly way of saying that, but you get what I mean. This method is really not the only way, and in many cases was actually not the most common way of making food offerings in ancient Greece. While, of course, burnt offerings did happen, we have so much scholarship on burnt offerings, there were many other methods of sacrifice that involved people or animals eating from the very food that was offered to the god. The idea with burnt offerings is that they're burnt completely, and then the ash is then, well, that's actually another whole discussion. There's a great book called Don't Throw Bones in the Temple or something like that. It's called Don't Throw Any Bones in the Sanctuary, which was a real thing carved on a sanctuary to Artemis, which is hilarious that throwing bones inside a temple was enough of a problem that they carved it into the top of the temple. So what they actually did with the ashes from burnt offerings is a whole other thing. It seems honestly, for the most part, that they just kind of deposited them in like kind of proto-charnel pits. Sometimes in one case, which was metal AF, they actually mixed the ash into like a building material to build an altar. Like, that's pretty freaking cool. That's respect. As I just mentioned, burnt offerings were not the only type of offering. In his essay, At the Table of the Gods, Divine Appetites and Animal Sacrifice, Jan-Mathieu Carbon? If you're Jan-Mathieu Carbon, comment below how to pronounce your name. He talks about the purposes of sacrifice, and the main reason is the connection with the divine. So he states, sacrifice is aimed at forming connections of all sorts. They could be performed to accompany and support the formulation of prayers, to seek to propitiate divine favor, to follow traditions of gift-giving to the gods, etc. On a very practical level, I would argue that communication was achieved through 2 other interrelated C's of sacrifice, consumption and commensality. The divine portion was either consumed by absorption, by fire, or in a form of presentation, while special portions for human participants were ingested or put to other uses, especially when inedible parts of the animal were concerned. Many times they actually found like bones of sacrificed animals just kind of on the walls of temples, so that was another way to use those inedible parts. But that is not all. Since a meal was shared, certain explicitly divine portions would be entirely or partially consumed by priests or other honored individuals. If the divine portions were completely consumed in the ritual, then we often find that these parts were anatomically connected to the special portions consumed by some human participants. So, for example, if a human ate a roast leg of lamb, then a roast leg of lamb would be sacrificed and a burnt offering to the god to kind of mirror that experience. Commensality, to define that word, because I didn't know it until I read this, commensality is literally the act of sharing a meal together, usually in regards to reinforce relationships or within a social group. I mean, think about how many feasts we do this time of year that are all about family, our group, or about celebrating a certain thing as a nation. Whatever your opinions on it, that's what commensality is about. Commensality with the gods is a way to establish our relationships with them and to invite them into our group or ourselves into theirs. It's one way that we are able to bridge the gap between the divine and the human. And while many people kind of viewed burnt offerings as a way to kind of show our subservience to the god and saying, you provided this meal for me and I am just a lowly human, rather this viewpoint argues that that is not necessarily the case and that it's kind of to enforce not our differences, but our similarities with the gods. Carbon ends his essay by saying, certain portions could be burned for them on the altar, releasing pleasing smoke and good omens, while others were roasted, achieving similar results. The same or related portions would then be consumed by human participants. Other parts could be set aside, displayed, used in some capacity, or even sampled for divine offerings. Most of this would eventually be eaten by the worshippers. Distinct or interconnected modes of consumption and commensality were developed, all of which conveyed close interactions with the gods. Nothing shows this commensality and closeness like my favorite form of offering and sacrifice, Trapezomata. Trapezomata literally means table offerings, and it's actually something that I've been doing without knowing the theory and literature behind it. I just did it because it felt right, and it's something that a lot of culture groups do. The name is exactly what it sounds like. You set out a plate, and sometimes additionally an extra chair, or in the ancient Greek case, a couch, and you would literally invite the deity to your table and host them. Sometimes worshippers would go and take a step further and bring out the statues of a god and place them on a couch with offerings laid on the table for them. And once the ritual had concluded, the priest would then eat the offering or split it amongst the other worshippers. What's interesting is this is something that you actually still see in culture groups today. Some of the local Italian-American communities in the area that I'm in, there is this idea of literally inviting a saint to your table. You set out a spot for them, you bring their statue, you sit them there, and then you all share a meal. Kind of a way that this tradition kind of lives on in the modern day. Unlike burnt offerings, Trapezomata were primarily bloodless. So in the paper, Trapezomata, a neglected aspect of Greek sacrifice, David Gill states that cakes, fruits, bread, libations, and such things as people themselves normally have had to eat. So these were left on tables or on the outside sacred places like Hermes, which I believe I covered in altars and sacred spaces, I think. I'll link it above, whatever it was. Hermes were like little traveler shrines, usually at like marking intersections and roads. They, ironically, given their name, did not initially have anything to do with Hermes, we think, but then eventually became associated not just with Hermes, but with other crossroads deities. And we have had examples, people putting garlands of them or leaving food at the base of the altar. This practice of Trapezomata was actually extremely prevalent in the household cult. While burnt offerings were often made in ritual contexts, like at a temple, or it was very common, I would say, in Homeric writings especially since a lot of them are about like kind of grand warriors and like the highest extreme of the extreme where they're burning like 1,000 cows for some reason. You see those a lot in that type of literature. But it seems to have been a very popular form of worship for ancient Greek households. You could just make this during your meal very, very simply, offering the smoke, like I've mentioned doing before, offering the smoke of a meal that you're making or the steam off of it, or pouring libations at the table. And in some cases, they wouldn't even necessarily have their own statue, but kind of have a dedicated object that was owned by that deity. I think it's truly incredible that the idea of commensality with the divine is one that's not just seen in ancient Greece, but all around the world. I mean, communion. Literally, the word communion is communing with people. That is an essential part of the Christian faith, and you're literally reenacting one of the most important events in the Bible, the Last Supper, which is all about commensality. By sharing in that, I mean, depending on if you're Catholic or if you're Protestant, there's the idea of like transfiguration. I think that's what it is, like the idea of it becoming flesh. But in other cases, it's just a way of kind of continuing that tradition of, you know, sharing in a meal, bread and wine, the simplest of things that we see all over ancient Greece, right? These are also bloodless offerings, that these are shared amongst worshipers. I keep bringing up Italian folk traditions, but again, there's another one of a St. Joseph's table where everyone in the community has their own table, or there's one person in the community who has a big table, and St. Joseph is literally invited to that table, as well as a couple of other people who are meant to kind of represent Jesus and Mary, like they kind of embody those entities at the table. And then the community eats from that table with them. And then even in a more modern case, you have a dumb supper. And that's a tradition in which a meal is consumed in complete silence, and you usually have an empty chair representing someone long past or multiple people long past. Some people get like throw out the food from the dumb supper, but other people, they then split it amongst themselves. It's funny because the dumb supper kind of echoes a earlier tradition in Anthesteria where a hero is invited to share in a silent drinking game. You even set up a chair for him. It's no mistake that this time of year, November and December, is a time that we cozy up and eat. I mean, this is a time when bears begin to hibernate, when squirrels attempt to dig up their hordes of acorns. And we brace ourselves for the darkest time of year. While, of course, many of this has been capitalized upon and kind of stripped away, there's a kernel of human truth beneath it all. Feasting is sacred, and it connects us not only to the people around us, but our ancestors of place, our ancestors of blood, and our ancestors of religion. It also celebrates the earth that bore us all of this fruit. So grab your favorite sweater, give thanks to the earth that holds you and all of this feast it has given to you, and I will see you in December when we put these theories to a taste test. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons, $5 tier and up: Annie Nagel, Grumpy Grandpa, Akeda Hakubi, Tanith, A Little Bayleaf, Brooke Sweeney, Charles Schneider, Ember Kelly, Paris Morsky, and Tiny Atlas. Thank you so much to my patrons. You really keep me going. Keep me going during these trying times. And with that, I will see you